Formula One is an incredibly inaccessible sport. Even if you're a wealthy individual wanting to go to a race, you're always slightly the wrong side of the chain link fence. What Drive to Survive did is it brought all of that inner sanctum into people's living rooms, provides a door to some behind the scenes access through a digital experience. I contacted PepsiCo at that time. They were a long way down the line to do a deal with McLaren, but they hadn't signed it, crucially. So we managed to position ourselves well. We got that deal over the line in a matter of, I think, under a week.
Today's guest is one of the most influential commercial strategists in global motorsport. Tom Potter is the CEO of Rush Sports and Entertainment, where he's led nearly $2 billion in brand partnerships across Formula One, Formula E, and motorsport with teams and brands. He's brokered deals with giants like IBM, Renesas, Petrobras, and Saudi Aramco, playing a pivotal role in bringing these brands into Formula One with teams including McLaren, Ferrari, and Aston Martin. Before founding Rush, Tom was already an F1 commercial veteran of Williams and McLaren teams, having previously been behind the wheel himself as a race car driver. In this episode, we dive into the business engine behind elite motorsport, strategy, negotiation, and how the world's fastest sport fuels billion-dollar partnerships, and what most brands still get wrong when trying to enter it. Tom, welcome to the show. Glad to have you here.
Thanks, Anas. Pleasure.
I'd like to give people an overview of your background for you being in this sport for many years.
Yeah, thanks, Anas. I grew up around motorsport. It was my father's passion and my grandfather's sport of choice, if you like. So I think that's where it all came from. I grew up wanting to be a Formula One driver. Didn't get as far up the motor racing ladder as I would have liked, but I was always good at finding myself sponsorship and had a strong interest in the commercial side of the sport. So when my driving career came to a premature end in the wall and a stint in hospital, after that I managed to get my foothold into Formula One with McLaren before I moved to Williams and ended up working for Sir Frank Williams for 10 years and then started my own business, Rush Sports and Entertainment.
It was a tragic halt to your career as a Formula One driver. I mean, how did you deal with that? How did you get over what happened because you were so passionate about the sport and industry?
Sure. I mean, I was a very lucky boy. Other drivers in previous races and a year before, a young driver I was racing against had very sadly died in an accident at Alton Park. Neil Shanahan, aged 19 at the time. So, I felt tremendously fortunate to be able to, after some recovery time, literally walk away and, reconsider the future and my options. As a racing driver, I was incredibly competitive individual and still am. I try to rein it in for the most appropriate moments, but that competitive instinct and wanting to extrapolate maximum performance from all areas, I simply tried to refocus into other areas of my life and doing deals in Formula One.
No, indeed. And you've made a huge success out of it as well. And what's your process for turning a motorsport pitch idea into a boardroom level strategy that wins that global buy-in?
Sure. I think it's a truism, but something that my dad drilled into me as a young boy, that when it comes to getting what you want, and usually to some extent or to a greater or lesser extent that requires selling, it's about using your ears and your mouth in the proportion that they were given to you. It's as simple as that. So that's the sort of premise it starts. And, it's also about asking the right questions when it comes to sponsorship. And we take a lot of time and have developed a robust process, which we call our 3D process, which we've refined over, almost 2 decades now in the sport, where it's really about that first phase is what we call the discovery phase. And that's about really understanding, getting under the skin of the brand's business that we're talking to. What are their marketing, their commercial objectives, their goals, but also their challenges. And not just from a brand or marketing perspective, but from a broader commercial perspective, both externally as well as internally. So, sponsorship in sport in particular can be a tremendously powerful platform to help businesses overcome challenges and accelerate growth in a variety of different ways. It's not all about media exposure or association with a particular property, athlete, or team. From there, it's once we understand what those objectives and goals are, it's about establishing what meaningful KPIs and measurements we need and metrics for the sponsorship are going to be meaningful to that particular business. I think it's often a mistake in sponsorship that people pitch on the face of it to similar businesses the same solution. But, the reality is that even if you were talking to, say, Coca-Cola and Pepsi, on the face of it, both sell a very similar soft drink. The reality is that at any one moment in time, they're going to have very, very distinct marketing goals, objectives, other macro business challenges and objectives. And the same solution is not necessarily going to be right for both, and it is certainly not going to have the same commercial value to each of them. So we get under the bonnet of that, if you like, and help to bring our 2.5 decades worth of sponsorship experience and insight to develop a really robust solution, apply some business rigor to developing a strong investment rationale that we can then present to the senior leadership team of the business to help give them confidence, but also clarity in how this sponsorship, this brand partnership is going to deliver a return on the investment for the business.
Sure. What sort of brands have you seen starting to come into this space? Because you've had your typical sponsors that we've always seen on the race cars going past and the teams. I mean, how have you seen the brands pivoting and coming into this space after, I suppose Drive to Survive, that kicked off a lot in the industry? I guess that's a two-part question. So, how do you see the new brands coming in, and how did Drive to Survive change the perception of the industry and made it more attractive and made more people want to come into it?
Yeah, and the sport is certainly, in terms of Formula One at least, seeing tremendous amount of growth in interest and enthusiasm. And, we can perhaps talk a little bit later about how that's come about, and the consumption of the sport by, a new, younger audience, and particularly an American audience as well, has helped. But I think from a sponsorship perspective, when I joined Williams, we were just leaving, I'd call the tobacco sponsorship era, where the biggest sponsors in Formula One were the tobacco companies, and there wasn't a lot that they could spend their marketing budgets on. But sponsorship was an area that was relatively free at that time. And so it was almost a blank check to the teams. And, literally all they had to do was, cover their cars in the liveries of the tobacco companies. But BMW coming into the sport had agreed with Frank Williams and Patrick Head at the time that they would do so on the basis that it was a clean car without tobacco sponsorship. They could see the writing on the wall, the negative association with tobacco. And so that created a new challenge for the team in sponsorship. And I joined at a time where we set about executing a strategy to attract more corporate sponsorships. And Williams was very successful over the next 5 to 10 years, building a portfolio of more business-oriented sponsors, which has really become the norm now in Formula One. We had more Fortune 500 sponsors than any other Formula One team at Williams, and in fact more than most other sports teams at the time. And what we realized was that Formula One was a fantastic environment in which to do business. The sport is unique in that it's a 2 to 3 day event, which provides a huge amount of time for relationship building and networking within the Formula One sponsor community. And that results in new relationships, enhanced relationships, and is a fantastic platform when leveraged well to deliver a very, very tangible return in terms of incremental business on the sponsorship.
So Drive to Survive changed everybody's perception of F1. It wanted to make people jump into it. There was this kind of fan mania around F1? I mean, how have you seen that
Yes.
change the landscape and people wanting to get involved from a demographic that didn't previously want to?
Yeah, I mean, so we're seeing a much younger audience becoming interested in the sport, and particularly a younger female audience as well. Very, very engaged, and obviously also an American audience as a result of Drive to Survive, but also the fact that there's now three Formula One races in the US, which is, more than most other countries. Only Italy has two races. Most countries can only dream of having one race. But I think the reason why it's been so successful is, Formula One is an incredibly inaccessible sport relative to almost every other sport. It's a limited number of events. They're expensive to get to, and they're expensive to access, even at a general admission level, relatively speaking, in the sporting world. And then even if you're a wealthy individual wanting to go to a race, there's a limit to the access you can get. You're always slightly the wrong side of the chain link fence, if you like, in terms of getting access to the inner sanctum of the sport, where you can get up close to the actual race cars and the drivers and the other personalities and celebrities of the sport. And what Drive to Survive did is it brought all of that inner sanctum into people's living rooms and gave them an opportunity to engage in the more human stories behind the sport. And the most successful TV content is about telling human stories, and whether it's a soap opera or whether it's a documentary about, an explorer or a naturalist. I was just thinking of David Attenborough turning 99. So, but it's his personality and his human story. So that's what Netflix did, was lift the lid on the drivers. Previously all you got really was the race footage and then some preamble and post race analysis with some interviews of the drivers, but it was always very technical about what was happened in the race. There was nothing about you didn't really get into their personalities and their lifestyles and the different personality strengths and weaknesses which come across so well and are captured by Netflix in Drive to Survive. And I think it's tremendously engaging content. What's interesting is that other sports have tried to replicate the Drive to Survive format with relatively limited success. I don't think any of the other series that have tried to recreate the format in their own sport have had the same success as Drive to Survive. Even those ones that were produced by the same company, Box to Box, which produces Drive to Survive. They've just discontinued their Tour de France Unchained version of Drive to Survive for cycling. So it's interesting, and I think Formula One just has the right ingredients. It's tremendously thrilling. The drivers are very interesting, intelligent, articulate individuals that are, taking part in an incredibly dangerous and exhilarating sport that is very gladiatorial, and other sports don't have that same degree of jeopardy that Formula One does. I think the golf full swing, you realize that yes, it's stressful for the players, but sort of the worst thing happens is that their ball goes in a bunker and they go a shot over. In Formula One, they have a massive crash and suddenly their team's unhappy, their drive is at stake, and they might have even really hurt themselves. So it's a very unique and engaging sport from that perspective.
100%. Yeah, there's definitely a lot more at risk in terms of the sport. And IBM's partnership with Ferrari isn't just branding, it's AI integration, fan engagement, and digital transformation. I mean, how do you structure deals that embed a sponsor into both the performance and the narrative at the same time?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, Anas, and I think it comes down to the fact that the most successful sponsorships, and IBM is one of the most sophisticated sponsors out there. They've sponsored the Masters, Wimbledon for decades, the US Open. They know what they're doing when it comes to sponsorship. And the secret to success is creating an authentic partnership that is very natural in the space, but also adding value. Fans can have a neutral or even a negative response to sponsors who appear to be just taking advantage of the fandom. We see that in football where, the fans are a little more stronger in their engagement with the fans, and whether they like them or not, and they're bringing value to their club. And I think that's where sophisticated sponsors try to add value for the fans. And you pick a great example of what IBM is doing with Ferrari, where they are using their incredible technology and emerging technology like AI to develop a fan engagement platform in the Scuderia Ferrari app by IBM, which adds value to the fans, helps them to understand what's going on in the race, what went on in the race, what they can expect going forward. And a bit like Drive to Survive, provides a door to some behind the scenes access through a digital experience. And, it's tremendously exciting.
No, it is. It is indeed. And where do you see the space going? Because I feel this is the beginning of AI and fan engagement. I mean, we saw the narrative coming years ago, right? So there are a lot of people who try to position themselves to actually take advantage of this. And now IBM is leading the way with Ferrari and using their own, Scuderia app as the main example. I mean, what doors do you see this opening? Like, being a futurist, are people going to put AR and VR glasses, and could they be in the driver's seat with the driver, using that telemetry data to symbolize or recreate real races? I'm just trying to open up, the imagination side of it. Where do you see this going?
Yeah, well, I think, Formula One is all about technology. It's a technology driven sport. And wherever technology can add performance or efficiency to the team, they're going to adopt it. What's really interesting is where technology is used first for performance enhancement of the team, but then that translates into creating an enhanced experience for the fans. And we've seen that with how the teams visualize data from the cars. There's an incredible amount of data coming off the cars, and that has translated into enhanced screen graphics through the work that AWS, for example, has done with Formula One. You get a lot more information and insight into what's going on during the race broadcast through some new screen graphics, which the fans now, really embrace.
Yeah, no, definitely. And with F1 doubling as a geopolitical platform from Vegas to Jeddah, how has this new era of nation-backed events changed the way you sell and activate these price sponsorships?
Sure. Well, I think, Formula One races have always been expensive to secure and bring on. Under Bernie Ecclestone's leadership, he kept it to a much smaller number of events. Now, Liberty has managed to expand the calendar to 24 races, which is probably close to, if not the limit. But they've also entered into longer term deals with the race promoters. So I think Miami just announced a new deal through to 2040. And many of the race promoters have entered into 10-year renewal cycles, which is a lot longer than they used to. And that's proving to be effective because what sponsors want, and also what the host media broadcasters, the F1 broadcasters want, is repeatability and certainty. So they want to know that the calendar of events is going to look broadly like this for as long as possible. So that's giving everyone a lot more confidence in what they're buying into, whether that's sponsors, media partners, other race promoters, etc., etc. So that's adding value to the proposition. It's adding confidence to the proposition. And now Formula One, with an audience which is for most of the races equivalent to a Super Bowl audience, but on a global scale, you're looking at 24 Super Bowls around the world. And really, there is no other sport or entertainment property on the planet which offers that global presence as well as local events in so many key markets. And Formula One has a very healthy mix of the established markets in Europe and the Americas, as well as the more emerging markets. And we've seen the success that Formula One's had in Singapore, which is really still the jewel in the F1 crown, perhaps alongside Monaco for more historical reasons. And that's what sponsors are looking for, something which offers that efficiency all over the world.
Indeed. And do you find Saudi Arabia has been this new host in Formula One? And how do you find they've contributed Formula One in setting up their first races to Formula E? And what does that signal to the rest of motorsport? Because they have championed a direction and a huge push into motorsport. And I guess everybody else is watching what's happening there, especially with Vision 2030 and beyond, and taking notes and learning lessons from that, and also trying to remodel or try to be involved in the system that they're creating over there.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's happening in sport in general with Saudi is tremendously exciting. They're investing a lot into sport across the board. Motorsport, because of its global relevance and significance, is certainly a key pillar of that, it appears. With respect to Formula One, they've built one of the most exciting street circuits at Jeddah, incredibly fast. It's produced some very spectacular races, and I think it's already helping to, change some perceptions of Saudi Arabia for the better. And sport has always been a great platform for bringing different cultures and other geopolitical entities together. So that's a good thing, I think.
It is indeed. And what do you think that signaled to the rest of the sports sponsorship world, Saudi's ambitions in the industry?
Huge ambition there, clearly. They're building other Formula One circuits, FIA Grade 1 circuits. Qiddiya and Neom are developing broader motorsports offerings as well. It's not just Formula One that they're looking to host. You've got the Formula E race in Riyadh, the existing Formula One race in Jeddah. There's actually, it's emerging competition between those locations for motorsport properties. And, at some point, it wouldn't surprise me if there were two Formula One races in Saudi. We'll have to wait and see. But we've now got 4 races in the Gulf with Qatar, Bahrain, and Abu Dhabi. Saudi's tremendously exciting for all sport. We've seen Aramco sponsoring Formula One initially as an F1 global partner, subsequently as a partner of Aston Martin. Now that's expanded into title partnership, but they've also invested heavily in other sports too.
Gen Z is now the fastest growing audience. I mean, when you work with brands, how do you help them move beyond their traditional activation to actually capture the new generation's attention and loyalty with the shrinking attention span?
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting challenge, but what we dive into as part of our initial discovery phase of our 3D approach is who is the sponsor trying to attract, and segmenting the sports audience but also their audience. Not sometimes sponsors are looking for a broad audience, and you've got to look at different ways to reach those different audiences within their target. So we're very conscious to look at how different generations, different genders, different socio-economic demographics are consuming the sport. And we can be very, very targeted with the sponsorships and the activations around those sponsorships to best connect with and engage with those audiences. So, and different platforms are emerging that are catering for those different audience types. So whether you are more a F1 aficionado who loves the racing and the technology, and you just want to know about tire strategy and the use of AI to inform race strategy and development of the car and so on. There's a place for that. But now there's also a place for communications with the fans that aren't interested in that. They find the racing thrilling, but they're also interested in, the fashion that the drivers are wearing, their girlfriends, their lifestyles around the sport. So we look at, how they're consuming the sport, when they're consuming the sport. You're right to say the attention span is less, and Formula One has seen an increase in an audience consuming its YouTube channel content, and it's more short form highlights of the races, etc. And that's something that's an interesting trend to watch and consciously be aware of, so that your activations around a sponsorship are best targeted.
And there was a stat we discussed a while back where women are the largest consumers, the largest viewers in Formula One. Just to delve into that a little bit, because
Yeah, no. So I think what you mean to say is that Formula One has the largest female audience of any sport, and it's something that has actually been true for longer than people might imagine. And when I say any sport, I mean single sporting event. So Formula One has, in its most popular markets, the audience is pretty representative of the national demographic. So in markets like the UK, Italy, Germany, where Formula One is a long established has a long established audience, the demographic for the fan base represents the national demographic. And in Italy, there's slightly more women than men, and the audience reflects that too. So when you add that up and look at the actual numbers of Formula One, and you've got around about 100 million on average watching each race, not to mention another 100 million who are following it across social media and other digital media and other media outlets. That's a large number of women. And for as long as I can remember working in the sport and meeting guests, sponsors at races and fans at the races, female fans have been some of the most engaged and knowledgeable fans that I've met. Yet, until very recently, the perception has always been it's petrol heads, middle-aged bald blokes who like fast cars, which was a misperception, but that is being corrected. And I think that's because we're seeing from Formula One more targeted, specific communications at the female audience. And we're seeing, as a result of Drive to Survive, but also the fact that the new generation of drivers coming into the sport are far more active on social media and far more open about their lives as drivers, but also as athletes and individuals away from the racetrack, that's helping to engage a younger female audience, and that's helping to shift the popular understanding of who Formula One's audience is. And that's now translating into new sponsorships from traditionally, female oriented brands, notably LMS, Charlotte Tilbury, etc.
I was going to ask you, did you see that in the reflection, of the brands coming in and the pivot and shift happening, because they're slowly starting to realize that, hold on a second, with delivery that's been put on the vehicles or the cars previously, we're missing a huge segment. I mean, it could be a really big revenue generating and promotional push, right? Brand positioning for all of these new companies coming into motorsport.
Yeah, I think there's no coincidence that LVMH has come in as a major new sponsor of Formula One this year, and a rumored $100 million a year multi-brand deal, including Tag Heuer, of course, but also Louis Vuitton. And I'm certain that's because they've done their homework and seen that Formula One is appropriate, hard and expensive to reach demographic that buys LVMH goods, but also an increasingly female audience.
No, indeed. And, looking ahead, what trend do you think will redefine sponsorship the most? Is it AI driven personalization, immersive fan tech, sustainability linked KPIs? I mean, what do you see that's going to really spearhead the way?
I think technology is really exciting, and the opportunity for sports to get a more detailed understanding of who their fan base actually is on a personal level rather than a sort of broad assumptive research level. So, first party data, but also then being able to offer more targeted sponsorship interactions, the ability for sponsors to develop a direct communication around the sport with the fan base and offer products and services at a more timely moment for the fans on an individual basis, so that they have a more direct transactional relationship with the fan base. At the moment, that's still quite disconnected, and technology is helping to close that gap through components like fan apps, etc.
And what have been some of like the aha moments? You've obviously had a big career in branding and deals, and there must have been some points where you turned around and went, "Hold on a second, I didn't see that coming." What were some of those moments where it kind of just hit you sideways?
I think a good example would be Lego's activation at the Miami Grand Prix. If you didn't see it, Lego have been producing a series of F1 and Formula One team licensed models over recent years, and that's really taking off. And they decided to work with Formula One and create some life-size Lego models. And before each race, there's a driver parade where traditionally the drivers get on the back of a flatbed articulated lorry and drive round the circuit and wave to the fans in the crowds. And some races have done that where they've had vintage cars or what have you, convertible vintage cars typically, that the drivers sit on the back of and wave. And with Lego, Formula One created these life-size Lego Formula One car models that the drivers could actually drive. And it was tremendous fun. But why it was so successful, I think, is you could see how much joy and amusement it was bringing to the drivers, because being Formula One drivers, they naturally started racing these cars, which they'd never do if they were driving around, some vintage cars or what have you. And it created something that immediately went viral on social media, creating a lot of interest and exposure, and for Lego as well as the sponsors involved. And so that was very, very clever. And I'm sure they will repeat it, having invested in producing these cars once they've repaired some of the crash damage from Miami. But tremendously successful, and one of the highlights of the Miami Grand Prix, even though it was two exciting races there with an exciting sprint race and feature race. So it'll be interesting to see how they keep that momentum up. Now that people have seen it, I'm sure people want to see it again. How they keep it fresh, and it's they to make sure they have not. I think the expression is "jump the shark," if you like. So that was a good one. The other sort of general trend is really that sponsorship, as I think you said earlier, about it traditionally being a branding led sponsorship, raise global brand awareness. It's all about visibility on the cars and drivers. The fact is now that if sponsors aren't looking at it this way, they should be, is that the branding is really the validation of a much deeper and more meaningful partnership. And certainly the branding value, the exposure value should be the icing on the cake and not the cake.
No, indeed. It's all about the association of where you are, like brand placement. It also helps build that brand's value in the eyes of the other people, is where they actually see that brand showing up. And I feel that with social media, there's been this huge push with brands just having a one-track mind, when all of these other brands which are now coming into the space, they're like, hold on a second, we've missed this huge opportunity here that we need to scramble and get into now. So totally agree with the point that you made.
Yeah, so a good point on social media, be it that association with Formula One and the storytelling that it enables brands to have around their partnership creates a lot more engagement on social media than just doing brand or product-led campaigns.
Yeah. And what have been some of the moments in your career which have really stuck with you? Like proud moments, moments of achievement, moments that you will never ever forget.
I love the feeling of doing a deal, and I've been fortunate enough to do some of the bigger deals in Formula One. I think remembering my first Formula One sponsorship deal, which was with PepsiCo for Seven Up with BMW Williams, and the fact was when I contacted PepsiCo at that time, it became very apparent very quickly that they were a long way down the line to do a deal with McLaren, and had indeed were planning to do a deal with McLaren. And so far as McLaren were concerned, they were going to do a deal with McLaren, I think, but they hadn't signed it, crucially. And so we managed to position ourselves well and secure that deal from in probably record time. I don't think I've ever secured a deal so quickly, but respect to McLaren who'd done the hard work, perhaps, and we got that deal over the line in a matter of I think under a week. But it was some very intense negotiations, locked away in a room in New York.
No, definitely. That sounds amazing. And I always ask this question to the guest, and it's kind of a sideways based question. Like, if you were to give your last 30-second speech to the world, what would it be?
I think it boils down to what I'd say to my children is, always follow what you're passionate about, and don't be scared to take risk to pursue that passion. I was very fortunate that I managed to secure a role in Formula One. Pretty much my first job interview was with Frank Williams, which was incredibly intimidating but also exhilarating. He was a hero of my father's, a hero of mine, and just to meet him was a fantastic experience and an awesome experience. But to be in a job interview at the same time made it more challenging. But I'm happy to say we got on along really well, and I got the job and ended up working for him for 10 years. So, that's certainly a career highlight to have been through that process at, quite a young age, and then, made it stick for 10 years, worked my way up the ranks at Williams, and then started my own business.
That's a very inspirational story. That is, and I'm sure it will inspire the younger generations to come. Go after your
Right.
dreams, even if you're scared in the moment with the mix of emotions. So no, thank you very much for your insights, Tom. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast, and we'll definitely get you on again to share more of your stories.
Thanks very much, Anis. Look forward to seeing it.